Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Tracy, I'm glad to have you back again. Are you ready for our second video in our vocabulary series?
I'm absolutely ready. Let's get started.
All right, I'm super excited. So today, in our second video in the series, we are still talking about planning for implementation for vocabulary instruction. And in today's segment, we are really focusing on our learners. Who are they? A little bit about their profiles, specifically their needs. And so we can really support individual learners as they are participating in vocabulary instruction. So there are some very specific targets, word recognition in particular, where students are really trying to decode those words and figure out the vocabulary words themselves for independent use of vocabulary. So we may support a little bit of that phonological awareness or phonics related piece really, so that those words start to have a little bit more automatic recognition over time. And of course, language usage and using vocabulary hopefully will lead to them becoming more permanent in students' background knowledge. This all requires lots of collaboration. So I think our conversation today will really hinge on planning and collaboration for vocabulary instruction to make sure our learners feel super supported as they embark on this new experience and new content. So what are some of those questions that we're really targeting today, Tracy?
Well, today we're going to talk about what drives vocabulary selection. And there are two particular pieces that we're going to try to really address. Do all learners, and we mean all, the spectrum of diversity, so including complex disabilities, English learners, and other groups that are within that continuum, including even students who are identified as gifted and talented. So do they have access to and actually learn grade level vocabulary? There's a difference just providing access rather than really monitoring for their understanding. Also, did we develop and select materials for explicit instruction? Remember, we really hit that hard in the last video. So if you didn't watch it, we recommend that you do. And assessment of vocabulary. So we're teaching it, but we're also assessing what we teach through both through reading, writing, and communicating. So we really need to focus on communicating also across every student, each student.
Yeah, Tracy, actually, I'm thrilled that we're going to talk a little bit about communication here, because part of the reason that target was really in word recognition is to access a lot of this vocabulary for learners who use alternate modes of communication.
Yes.
The spelling of those words is what provides them access. So this is really an important conversation today as well. So I'm glad you put that communication piece in there. Super important.
Right. And it's not just about pictures. It is about the actual word and providing access to the actual reading of that word to all students. So as we go through here, we're going to look at role-specific questions and supporting our learners. That's our lens today, is supporting our learners. So administrators may ask themselves, who collaborates to develop this plan to select vocabulary? That's very important, and administrators are the folks who really put that organization in place and say, you know, this person would be great to collaborate with this person, and we're going to provide the opportunities for them to collaborate. Also, is there a collaborative culture that is established and maintained? Teaming, is that really super important in the culture? That is huge. And also inclusion of all learners with equitable access to explicit instruction. Not, hey, it's you know, time for ELA, we're going to pull some students out and do something different. Is there equitable access? This is really an administrator question that they should be asking all the time. Also, we know the importance of coaches. They can ask themselves, how can I support the collaboration between content specialists and other specialists? So the general educators and intervention specialists, and not just in a co-teaching situation, but across the board. Is everyone collaborating and involved in, let's say, department meetings and those types of things? What resources can a coach share with the planning team to encourage collaboration? They're the people like that glue, keeping everyone together and on track. So our specialists would ask themselves, who are our learners? Who's walking in our door? Who's walking in the person's door next to us? And what do they need? What does the individual student need, as well as what is needed universally? So they also ask themselves, what vocabulary tools or templates can they share with learners to scaffold their understanding and help with recall of meaning and decoding? So that is very important as a support to the content specialists, particularly in a co-teaching situation, but outside of that situation also in either a in-class support or consultative mode. So we have our content specialists, our subject specialist people, and they would also be asking themselves, who are our learners? Because we're not a one-size-fits-all educational paradigm. So what do they need? What does every student need universally in our classes? And how do we collaborate with specialists to integrate supports and services as universal or individualized features in planning, instruction, and assessment? We need all those three pieces to have a holistic educational system for our students to learn within. How can we support the individual needs also? That's really important in Tier 1 instruction. So we need to stop and think about our current practices. And we love this question. It really got us thinking about our practices and about practices of teachers within the districts that we support, and also past practices that we believed were correct. So we ask ourselves, have we modified, which actually means lowering the expectation for vocabulary for learners with disabilities or other groups of diverse learners, that cuts out Tier 2 and 3 vocabulary? Are we just giving them access to that minimum amount of vocabulary that won't necessarily allow them to have access to the standards? So in other words, are we taking learners away from the grade level general education curriculum rather than connecting them to the general education curriculum? That's our job, is as connectors for students to be able to access and engage with grade level curriculum. So as we go through this session, if this is a practice, this is unequivocal, we must discontinue this practice of providing less to certain students and more to others. This is truly an equity issue. So, it's no blame or anything like that. When we know better, we do better. So let's think about this question as we go through this video today. So we're really going to talk a lot about research as it pertains to vocabulary today, but we wanted to ground our discussion around research through the Ohio Improvement Process, 5-step process. And that is essentially a problem-solving process that begins with knowing your students, identifying the critical needs, identifying what they need to know in the curriculum, the standards, and what are their specific needs, learning needs. After we know that, then we move to researching evidence-based strategies and practices. So we're matching these things, and Sean is really going to go into some research that will help support vocabulary and how we should be approaching it. Next is, after we've researched, then we plan. We proactively plan so that it addresses all students. We plan and then we implement that plan as designed. So we are really designing these things to meet the needs of all students. And we're monitoring, is what we're doing working? Are students learning? We're doing those checks. And then fifth is, we look at what we've done as adults in the classroom. We look at our curriculum maps. We look at all that stuff and we reflect on it and examine, did this meet the needs of our students? And if not, let's go back to number one and relook at the needs of students. All these things need to be in place collaboratively. These can't be done individually, where an individual student or teacher sits in their classroom and says, I'm identifying the needs and I'm researching. This is truly a collaborative process in order for it to work and to support implementation of vocabulary best practices.
Thanks, Tracy, for reviewing the 5-step process. I think it's important that people are really aware that this is very cyclical, and that we are going to focus today on the planning piece, but our first step in that is really knowing what to put in the plan. And so let's kind of step into that research piece. What are some evidence-based practices or high yield strategies that we really should embed in our plan to really ensure students of all varieties, as you've talked about, that wide array of diversity, will really have access to the general curriculum and this vocabulary instruction. So we want to reference the Hattie research. John Hattie's research, of course, is very robust. It does outline a variety of evidence-based practices and strategies, those with the highest yield, where really we can close that gap, as we talked about before. It's really about ramping up and ensuring that we're moving students closer and closer to those general ed outcomes and targets. And in order to do that, we have to pick the right strategies that are going to really accelerate and sometimes learning. Beyond just that grade level acquisition per year. Sometimes students need more than that to close the gap. So there are some specific strategies here, like explicit instruction, which we talked about in our first video. But in addition to that, of course, teacher understanding of what it is they're teaching. That teacher clarity is a huge piece or a critical piece to this work as well. And of course, things like the collective teacher efficacy, where we're working collaboratively and together. We have that one vision and mission in mind, and we're all kind of working toward those end goals. So there are a lot of evidence-based strategies that we can bring in here into our planning structure. And so sometimes we just have to understand, and Hattie's quote here from 2009 tells us that we really have a rich body of research. There's a lot of information out there, but we're not always putting that research into practice. And so sometimes we have to make the connection between research and practice. And one way to do that is actually to make sure we're taking the right pieces for accelerating instruction. We're putting them directly into the plan that teachers are following on an everyday basis. And so that helps us get it into practice, or at least closer to getting it into practice. So we're going to try to close that gap between research and practice here. So there are some specific strategies also that Marzano and Hattie have agreed upon or that have come together. Do you want to share a little bit about those, Tracy?
Sure. One strategy is a clear focus for the lesson. So teacher clarity, that they really design the lesson to meet the tip-to-tip needs of all students within their classroom. And it's not just an agenda, and it's not just a checklist of things to do, but it's clear. They've chosen everything that they need for vocabulary. They know exactly how they're going to teach it. There is a routine that students are comfortable with. It's very clear, the expectations. Also, offer overt instruction. So we are not assuming that because someone reads a book or a text that they are understanding. We are offering explicit instruction around vocabulary, and we do that last step of a check for understanding for students so that we are very sure that they understand those words in order to be able to access those standards. 3 is get the students to engage with the content. They cannot be passive learners unless you are in the text or in the conversation and communication. They are not going to be engaged. So passive learning doesn't work. We know that. 4 is excellent. Give feedback, and that's a two-way feedback, so that the students are giving you feedback and you're giving them feedback also. It's a communication. Also, giving feedback to collaborative partners, collaborative adult partners. That's very important to continue to go back to strategy 1 and continue that clarity of focus. Multiple exposures. We can't just say, here's a word, write a sentence, done. These are multiple exposures, and this is in step 3 of explicit instruction. When we're talking about examples, we're giving examples. We're having the students talk with them. We're talking about non-examples, and tier 2 words, exposing them across different content is amazing. And lastly, have students apply their knowledge. So this is part of the, showing what they know. And it's very important that they're not just taking things in, but that they're understanding there's a purpose and an application for everything they're doing. So these are great lists, and Marzano and Hattie are really solid research on which to base your practices.
Right. And I think it's important that we recognize that there are a lot of bodies of research that we would consider kind of universal or general research entities or professionals, and very specific strategies that have come out of that large body of research. But I want to take us into a little bit of a deeper dive, Tracy, because in addition to this research, there is additional research that we could layer on here specific to certain subgroups of learners. So we've mentioned this wide array of diversity, from English learners to gifted students who are gifted and accelerated in certain areas or subject areas or topics. And it is also a possibility, as we've talked about diversity, that we also have learners who have a diversity range that includes disability. And so there are some very specific evidence-based practices or research-based practices for students in some of those subgroups as well. So I wanted to just put into our presentation today that in addition to the research that Hattie and Marzano and Anita Archer and lots of the others that we've mentioned here today and in our other videos, that there is explicit research that does show that vocabulary instruction is super important for learners of a variety of diversity types, including English learners. We don't have a slide for that, but definitely that is a group that really relies heavily on explicit vocabulary instruction as well. So for learners who have complex or significant cognitive disabilities, Definitely teaching vocabulary ranks right up there as one of those large evidence-based practices, in addition to many other pieces that we've talked about. So those teaching targets, so teaching those academic areas explicitly. And we see universally that explicit instruction is on the list here. Again, when I think about learners on the autism spectrum, there are also very specific evidence-based practices with learners in the autism spectrum. And again, a lot of these supports that we've been talking about, like how will learners receive vocabulary instruction in some of these groups, we need to know what's going to make the biggest difference for them and how we can scaffold and support vocabulary that is unique to some of our groups. So when we think about learners who are blind or visually impaired, or learners who may be deaf or hard of hearing, again, teaching vocabulary is right in there as one of those high yield strategies or practices that is top of our radar with the work that we're really doing today. So let's kind of dig into this. And there are some resources that you'll find in the resource section. We'll probably have some information there about the 5-step process, if that's not something that's familiar. You know, Tracy and I will include some resources there with that process in general. But there are also some planning tools that go along with the 5-step process that we can reference and share with you. And so we will make sure that those resources are part of this kind of toolkit that you're developing around co-planning, collaboration, and vocabulary instruction. So Tracy, we've talked a lot about supports, and as we've described it, as you've started to describe it, it's really this layer cake approach, isn't it? And there are specific layers that we need to, I think, bring out and talk about. Would you like to share a little bit about some of those layers of accessibility?
Yes. And this is a graphic that is specific to Ohio's accessibility features in their state tests. So I think it was very forward thinking to add these layers into the assessment universally. So the first thing we would consider are administrative considerations. How can the administrators support the vocabulary acquisition of all students? Next is universal tools. How can, in the classroom, we universally address how students learn, the information that we provide to them, as well as how we can tell they understand. So we're looking, you can look up Universal Design for Learning if you're not familiar with it. And there are UDL, Universal Design for Learning guidelines that are on cast.org. And I highly recommend looking at those. That's something you can do in absolutely every classroom every day, is you can vary your representation. You can vary how students express what they know, as well as engagement. Engagement is huge. So then we have something called designated supports. And designated supports are, at least within our state test, something that is a little more specific, but it's available to everybody. You don't need an individualized education plan. You don't need something like that to receive these. This is just another layer of access. And then we get to accommodations, those types of things, assistive technology, things that really help them access specially designed instruction, those types of pieces that are available specifically to students who are identified as having a disability, or English learners, any of those students at the tips of the spectrum. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Shauna?
No, I mean, I think that overview is really super helpful. I will share that within each of these layers outlined in the guidance document for state testing accessibility, there are specific features that are kind of named as part of these layers, some universal features, some designated support features really that can be kind of turned on or turned off based on learner need of them. And then within the accommodations section, there are a wide array of features that students by IEP would have determination of eligibility to utilize those specific features for testing purposes. But one thing that I do want to mention is the features in these layers, or this layer cake of support, are not just for testing, are they? Like they
No,
really
they're not.
are. We've got to get a jump start before we ever test. We've got to actually see these implemented, and students need to be very familiar with them on an everyday basis. They need to have utilized these features and supports. So I think we'll take people into more of a class view of maybe what these features could potentially be and how a teacher could potentially organize. Like when you have a class of 30 kids and maybe you teach in high school or middle school, and that's not just 30 kids all day, but you have multiple groups of students coming to you over the course of the day. So it could potentially be like more like 100 kids or more than 100 kids that you're seeing. How do we really get to know what students need, what features they're going to need to access vocabulary instruction in every single classroom and subject area? And this is where that collaboration could really come in handy. And we need some kind of a tool, a document that really helps us organize the features for students to make sure they're available when students come to instruction. So let's take a look at those next. There are a couple of examples here. There are actually templates for this. Work, the example on the left-hand side, came out of some of the work. This was an adapted version, but it came out of some of the work with Elise Frittura from Wisconsin. And there are a variety of student names just going down the list. No student identifiers necessarily with last name, but we could use student ID numbers here as well. But then we go into this layer system in the document where it shows features that students would really need to have in order to participate and engage and actively be able to show what they know in relationship to learning. So Tracy, you mentioned universal design and the 3 layers of access in UDL, the multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement. And so there are some supports here that have been identified learner by learner, how they access best and features that would really support them. In addition to the last column, and this is an adapted column that we added to the document itself, the class profile, if you will. And these are very specific, explicit, more that accommodation layer that we saw in the layer cake that Tracy shared earlier. Some students need, in addition to these universal kind of access features, they have some very specific and unique supports that are individually their own, and they may not always be represented in those universal features, but they have to have them nonetheless. So we need a document that shows us all of these layers really. And so these are 2 examples of class profiles. The profile on the right-hand side, we created very specifically to dig a little deeper for students who do have specially designed instruction through an IEP. And it does outline specifically how teachers may have to adapt some content, which is part of SDI, and how they may have to adapt their delivery of instruction, and how they may have to adapt the methodology or the methods that they're using, the instructional practices really that they're using to deliver and design instruction, maybe the materials as well. And then lastly, again, some of those things like assistive technologies and accessible educational materials that students may have to have in addition to specially designed instruction. And you would find those in section 7 of a student's IEP. There are a lot of features there that we really need to get out and kind of extract out of the IEP and put them directly into a place where teachers of every subject area can know about them and integrate them every single day as they're engaging students in their class. So those are a couple of examples. Again, we'll put those templates in the resources section.
And I really love these at the beginning of the year.
Yes.
For teachers collaboratively to join together and figure out, do they need supports in reading? Do they need supports in math, executive function? What are those pieces we need to support? And then these act as resource documents throughout the year as you are unit and lesson planning say, we need to build in these things because this is step one of that 5-step
That's
process.
right.
You know, it's the critical need
Mhm.
beyond universal.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so this, you bring up a good point. Like at the very beginning of the year, if teacher-based teams or grade level teams or subject-specific teams, integrated teams, we hope, with a variety of specialists on them as well, we hope they're coming together at the very beginning of the year. And it may not be the time where they're really going through the cycle. They don't have all their data collected yet. It's a
Right.
brand new year. It's the perfect time to really build these class profiles so that they can be leveraged every time the team goes through the 5 steps. They're very cognizant about the learners and the needs that they have, and really embedding that into this next piece, which is an actual plan. It's how do we design in step 3 of the 5-step, the targets for instruction, which you can see here in number 1. It's outlined in number 1 on this 2-page kind of outline. So what are the targets for the instruction, and not just citing the standard. I know a lot of people cite the standard itself, and we did look at the standard for vocabulary selection in our first video. But in this case, and you mentioned this before, we really deconstruct that standard. There are a lot of skills within a skill set of a standard. The standard isn't one skill, it's many skills coming together. So really thinking about the standard in all of its explicit and kind of discrete skills. That's the first piece here. And those deconstructions really give teachers clarity about the explicit instruction, kind of step by step, that they have to teach to get students to that end goal, which is the result of grade level instruction. Hopefully students acquire that knowledge over the course of the year. In step 2 here, it's really just that outline, helping to kind of coach teachers that this may be a multi-week lesson. Even in day 1, what am I going to teach? On day 2, what am I going to teach? Really helping to outline the instruction itself. And for an explicit instruction routine, it's helpful to have that kind of an outline, really, where we're teaching incrementally, directly, and explicitly across a series of skills. And what are those skills? And what do I do? What do I teach first? And what do I teach after that? And then lastly, and this is that really critical step, and part of the reason we put this example in here is really the integration of those supports. So when we have these class profiles, it's not okay just to leave the information sit there, but the information from that profile really has to get into the lesson design. So when I'm teaching in a math specific subject area and I have a specific target for my instruction, what specific supports and services will be essential that we have in place before instruction begins or while instruction is happening. Those supports for students have to be there. And so it's really this kind of trickle down. So we know what kids need. We put it into a organized document by class, by subject area. And then we also get it into our actual plan of what it is that we're teaching specifically. One of the evidence-based practices that we have talked about is, of course, teacher clarity. But there's also another evidence-based practice that Hattie also talks about. It's that cognitive task analysis, where we mentally can take a large skill and we can break it down into smaller skills and smaller steps. And so those two evidence-based practices together can really be achieved by using a planning framework that helps almost coach us to deconstruct a standard from this very large entity into these smaller steps. So I think even embedding some elements to our planning that really kind of coach or scaffold teachers as they plan would be helpful. So really thinking about in that I do, we do, you do cycle, it's a possibility based on the need that you found in step 1 of certain students. It's a possibility some of your students may have some foundational skills, but not all of them. When I look over here at this base, if I think the general standard is here in the middle, and these are my skills of the general standard, these are base skills that laid the foundation for that general standard itself. But it's a possibility that some of our students may not have all of that fully developed, and we just need to know what skills or not points of knowledge could be missing from that base. It's a possibility from a vocabulary standpoint that students may, like you said before, Tracy, they may not have heard certain words before. And so it's a possibility that not only do they not know how to decode or read or know the meaning of a word, they quite honestly just have never heard it. And so we may have to actually dip back into the base and share text, share information, or help them listen to video or something where they actually do hear that word, maybe for the first time. They hear the pronunciation of it, they hear it in context. They maybe start to raise awareness here. And we do have to teach and expose when we know that there are missing links or missing skills here.
And when you're talking about that, English learners may pronounce these sounds differently, and their brain is trained to hear pronunciations in a certain way. So the more that we can expose them to the pronunciation that will help them spell and decode, encode and decode, then that is really going to help them store that knowledge.
Right, absolutely. So when a standard is deconstructed, so you can kind of see a 5th grade standard here, general standard, when it really is deconstructed, there could be many, many skills that could have a relationship with vocabulary, both from a reading standpoint or just a background knowledge or comprehension standpoint, or from a writing standpoint. This happens to be a 2-page extension or learning progression of the standard. And we just have, when we call all these skills apart, which of these are skills that the students have already in place, and which of these skills could potentially be missing as we start our instruction. Just important to know those things up front. So that when we design our day-by-day instruction, we know in that I do, we do, you do cycle of explicit instruction, when do we have to dip back and reteach something, revisit a skill that maybe was from the foundation or the base, even outside of the boundaries of the grade level. If we ignore that and we just keep on cruising, with grade level instruction, it's a possibility that not all the students will be on that learning train from the beginning. Sometimes we have to dip back and pick everybody up, and then we can move forward again. So I think it's really important here to have a plan and know students well enough to know when it's important to dip back and kind of reteach something as well. And so as a whole, we want to make sure that when we get to this 3rd step, we really know who needs what. And that can come from our data, like our assessment data, if there's a skill gap, but it could also mean an access barrier could potentially be experienced by students. So what if a student uses a different mode or a variety of modes of communication, but it's not a traditional spoken communication? So they may use alternate or augmentative communication system or signed language or something of that nature, where vocabulary will just need to look a little different. Their access to it may look a little different. We need to know when we have to teach those things particularly. And so there are some specifics here that we would integrate for students. Graphic organizers, we did call that out. That could be either a universal support or a support that's in the center where students can choose to use those features, or maybe not. They may not always need them. And sometimes, again, those universal, we talked about decoding. We really have to show kids how to pronounce those words, and that's a universal access feature. We're going to show phoneme by phoneme how that word is pronounced and how it's spelled. Actually, that helps us to encode the word then when we're writing the word. So those could be universal features we would add in for vocabulary instruction, but some of our students have to have them. We're offering them to all, which is wonderful under universal design. But we do have some students who that would be required based on their IEP or other specialized support plan from EL. You've mentioned EL several times, and English language learners definitely would need some of that specific instruction, and it probably is in their support plan. We just have to make sure that we do that in everyday instruction as well. So Tracy, to wrap up this segment, let's think about those look-fors that administrators may see when we are engaging in these routines of supporting students and co-planning. What are some things administrators should be looking for?
Well, one of the first things is the proactive piece, that there are consistent planning guides, templates, tools, those types of things to ensure that students tip to tip with their needs are being addressed. So, and that students' needs tip to tip are being addressed in every lesson. So again, that is proactive, and having it be consistent across your school at least is extremely helpful, because when we're talking about collaboration, especially, you know, they're going to need to be using the same tools in order to really talk about them. Secondly, looking at the materials that teachers are using. Are they providing scaffolding for vocabulary instruction? Do they provide decoding cues, but decoding? Okay, so we're not just relying on the cueing system or the visual image, but you can have that to support the actual spelling, decoding, and encoding of the word. Because remember, we're not just dealing with visuals now. We're literally teaching all students to read words. Thirdly, you can consider evidence of collaboration for equitable access. Vocabulary is across all subject areas. There are some co-taught situations. There are some situations where there are students with diverse learning needs just in the general education setting. And it's imperative that there is collaboration across all those areas to provide equitable access to vocabulary in general. And then as an administrator self-reflection, thinking about the system. How does the system's decisions impact teacher practice and learner outcomes? Is it allowing teachers to do what they need to do as far as collaboration? Is there time built into the schedule for them to collaborate? Is there a culture of collaboration? All those pieces are within the realm of the administrator setting that stage and that culture. So there are a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to look for to make sure these things are happening consistently across your system within the building.
All right, great. Thank you, Tracy, for kind of wrapping things up today. We hope that all of this information really is available and useful to all of our teams who are watching and listening today, and hopefully they can pull some of the resources that we've mentioned and put them into practice in their own teacher-based teams. And so for today, we're going to wrap things up, and we'll head on to video 3 next. Until then, thanks everybody for being here with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.